Lucas Brooks had always dreamed of owning a home that matched his lifestyle: modern, efficient, and free from unnecessary restrictions. After years of hard work in the tech industry, he finally found the perfect house in an upscale, well-maintained neighborhood that boasted pristine streets, manicured lawns, and a strong sense of exclusivity. He had done his research before moving in, ensuring that the community regulations aligned with his vision. Unlike other areas, this place didn't explicitly ban electric vehicle charging stations, which was a non-negotiable factor for him. He had been driving a Tesla for years, embracing its efficiency and sustainability, and planned to install a state-of-the-art wireless charging pad on his driveway, making his daily routine seamless. The house itself was everything he wanted: spacious yet minimalistic, equipped with smart home technology, and situated in a peaceful cul-de-sac where the silence was broken only by the occasional passing car or the distant hum of sprinklers watering perfectly trimmed hedges. It felt like an ideal setting, one that suited his preference for privacy and convenience. But what he didn't account for was that this sense of order and perfection came with an unspoken hierarchy, an invisible power structure that dictated who truly controlled the neighborhood. And at the center of it all was Karen Harper. The first time he met her, she seemed nothing more than a well-dressed, slightly overbearing neighbor with a penchant for unnecessary authority. It happened just a few hours after he had finished unpacking. He was in his garage, setting up his Tesla's smart charging system, when he heard the deliberate, clipped sound of footsteps on his driveway. Turning around, he saw her standing there, arms crossed, an artificial smile plastered on her face. She looked to be in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in beige slacks and a fitted blazer, with short, meticulously styled blonde hair that didn't move an inch in the light breeze. The kind of person who exuded the aura of someone who had spent years cultivating an image of being respected or feared within her community. "Hello there," she said, her voice carrying the overly polite tone of someone used to being in control. "I thought I'd stop by and introduce myself. I'm Karen Harper. I've been living here for over 20 years, and I'm part of the committee that keeps our little slice of heaven in perfect shape." Lucas shook her hand, offering a cordial but measured smile. "Nice to meet you, Karen. I'm Lucas. Just got everything moved in today." Her eyes flicked past him toward the garage, where the Tesla's sleek frame was visible. Then to the wireless charging station he had begun installing in the driveway, her lips pressed together in the slightest hint of disapproval. "I noticed the car," she said, her voice shifting into something more scrutinizing. "And the charger. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of the community guidelines. We have very specific regulations about external modifications to properties, and anything that affects the aesthetics of the neighborhood should be approved beforehand." Lucas had anticipated this. Before purchasing the house, he had meticulously reviewed the rulebook and found no direct mention of restrictions on EV chargers. If anything, the guidelines had vague clauses about maintaining uniformity, but nothing explicitly prohibiting his setup. "I looked into the regulations before moving in," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "There's no rule against installing an EV charger on private property." Karen's smile remained, but her eyes sharpened. "Well, perhaps not explicitly, but we do have a standard to maintain. It's about the principle of keeping the neighborhood consistent. We don't want to set a precedent where everyone starts making changes without consideration for the overall look and feel of the community." Lucas could already tell where this was going. She didn't have an official stance to stand on, but she was testing him, seeing if he would back down easily. He wasn't about to. "I understand the need for consistency," he replied, "but this is just a charging pad. It's flush with the driveway, practically invisible, unless you're looking for it. It's not like I'm putting up a neon sign or anything." Karen tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her next words. "It's not just about visibility, dear, it's about the impact. Once one person does something, others think they can do the same, and before you know it, we have people making all kinds of unsanctioned modifications, disrupting the harmony we've built here. I'm sure you understand how important it is to respect the community's expectations." Lucas forced a polite chuckle. "I respect the community, Karen, but I also respect my right to use my own property as intended. If there's a legitimate issue, I'd be happy to discuss it. Otherwise, I hope we can just be good neighbors." Her smile tightened. "Of course. Just something to keep in mind." With that, she turned on her heel and walked back toward her home, her presence lingering even after she disappeared from view. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. He had dealt with people like her before, the type who thrived on micromanaging others under the guise of maintaining order. It was annoying but not unexpected. He had no intention of causing trouble, but he also wasn't going to entertain baseless objections. That night, as he settled in, a light drizzle coated the pavement outside. He glanced through the blinds, watching the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. Just as he was about to turn away, a figure caught his eye. Karen was standing across the street, barely visible in the dim light, her gaze fixed on his house. She wasn't moving, just watching. A cold, creeping sense of unease settled in his stomach. He brushed it off, telling himself she was just nosy, maybe even checking if he had removed the charger. Still, something about her posture, the way she stood motionless in the rain, sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. He turned away from the window, pushing the unease aside. This was just an overbearing neighbor who didn't like change. Nothing more. At least that's what he told himself. Lucas had expected some pushback from Karen, but what happened next made it clear that she wasn't just a nosy neighbor with an inflated sense of authority. She was someone who refused to lose, someone who saw control not as a privilege but as a right. It started subtly, with small inconveniences that could have easily been dismissed as bad luck or coincidence. The first sign came one morning when Lucas stepped into his garage, only to find that his Tesla had not charged overnight. At first he assumed it was a software issue, something with the car's internal system, a simple glitch that could be resolved with a reboot. But after restarting the vehicle and running diagnostics, everything appeared normal, except for one thing: the charger wasn't providing power. He crouched down beside the charging station, checked the connections, tested the voltage. Nothing. The entire system was dead. Frustrated, he moved to the main electrical panel inside his house, flipping through breakers, making sure nothing had tripped. Everything seemed in order, yet when he returned to the garage, the charger remained lifeless. That's when he noticed something strange. Outside, near the edge of his driveway, where the wireless charging pad had been installed, the ground appeared disturbed. The neatly arranged gravel lining the driveway had been shifted, as if someone had walked through it recently. He knelt down, brushing his fingers against the stone, feeling the uneven patches where something had clearly been tampered with. His chest tightened. Someone had messed with the installation. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, he called the company that had installed the system, explaining the issue. Later that afternoon, a technician arrived, a man in his mid-40s who had been in the business long enough to know when something wasn't right. He ran through a checklist, testing different points in the system, and after about 20 minutes he let out a low whistle. "Well, that's not normal," he muttered, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. "What's wrong?" Lucas asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. The technician gestured toward the power unit. "The wiring's been cut." Lucas frowned. "Cut? As in?" "Intentionally." The man shrugged. "Not something that happens on its own, I'll tell you that much. Someone had to physically access this panel and disconnect it, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. It's a clean cut, no frayed edges. No accidental damage. This wasn't an animal chewing through wires or corrosion over time. Someone did this on purpose." A slow, burning frustration began to creep into Lucas's mind. He knew exactly who was behind this. There was no proof, no camera footage, no direct evidence, but there didn't need to be. Karen had made her position clear from day one. She saw his charger as a violation of her perceived authority, and if she couldn't get rid of it through rules, she would resort to other means. Lucas exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Can you fix it?" The technician nodded. "Yeah, but you might want to consider getting some cameras out here. If someone went through the trouble of cutting this once, they might try again." Lucas agreed. The repair took a little over an hour, and when the technician left, Lucas immediately went online, ordering a set of high-resolution security cameras that would cover both his driveway and the garage. If Karen or anyone else tried to sabotage him again, he would catch them in the act. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day, an official-looking letter arrived in his mailbox. The envelope was thick, the kind that carried authority, and when he opened it, his stomach twisted. It was a formal notice from the neighborhood's regulatory board, informing him that a complaint had been filed regarding his charging station. According to the document, he was in violation of aesthetic and structural regulations. And if he did not remove the station within 10 days, he would face a daily fine. Lucas's hands tightened around the paper. This was her doing. She had gone straight to the board, leveraging whatever influence she had to escalate the situation. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. If she thought a piece of paper was going to intimidate him, she was wrong. He immediately contacted a lawyer specializing in property disputes, explaining the situation. The lawyer, an experienced man named David Crane, listened patiently before letting out a quiet chuckle. "I've dealt with these kinds of cases before," he said. "They're banking on you backing down, but if your installation doesn't actually violate any written regulations, then you have nothing to worry about." Lucas exhaled, feeling some relief. So they can't actually enforce this. Not legally, no, but that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life miserable in the meantime. That turned out to be an understatement. Over the next few days, small but deliberate acts of harassment began to escalate. One morning, Lucas stepped outside to find his trash cans knocked over, garbage strewn across his driveway. Another night, a neighbor who had previously been friendly with him suddenly avoided eye contact, hurrying past without so much as a nod. Then, the real breaking point came when he found a note taped to his front door. The paper was folded neatly, but the message inside was anything but polite: "Take your charger in your ugly car and leave. You don't belong here." Lucas's grip on the note tightened as a cold wave of anger coursed through him. This wasn't just about a charging station anymore. It was about control, about power, about someone who refused to let change disrupt their carefully curated world. Karen wasn't just trying to make him remove the charger, she wanted him gone. That night, as he installed the security cameras, he realized something: this wasn't going to stop on its own. If he wanted to put an end to it, he had to take action. He had played nice, followed the rules, tried to be the reasonable neighbor. But now it was clear. Karen didn't want peace. She wanted submission. And Lucas had no intention of giving her what she wanted. Lucas had never been the kind of person to start conflicts, but he had always believed in standing his ground when necessary. Over the years, working in high-pressure environments had taught him how to handle difficult personalities, those who thrived on control, manipulation, and intimidation. Karen fit that mold perfectly. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was someone who believed she owned the neighborhood, that her word was law, and anyone who dared challenge that authority would be met with relentless resistance. Lucas knew that simply ignoring her wouldn't be enough. She had already crossed the line into active sabotage, and now, with the official complaint from the board and the note left on his door, it was clear she wouldn't stop until he either submitted to her demands or left entirely. He wasn't about to do either. The first thing he did was ensure that his security cameras were fully operational. He spent the evening meticulously positioning them, making sure every angle of his property was covered: his driveway, the garage, the front entrance. He configured the motion detection settings to alert him instantly if anyone approached. Once they were set up, he tested them, walking back and forth across his yard while monitoring the feed on his phone. Everything was working perfectly. If Karen or anyone else tried to tamper with his property again, he would have the evidence to hold them accountable. The following morning, he took the complaint letter to his lawyer. David Crane, a seasoned expert in property law, skimmed through the document before leaning back in his chair with a knowing smirk. "This isn't enforceable," he said, tapping the paper. "They're hoping you don't know that. The wording here is vague, intentionally so. They're citing aesthetic and structural regulations, but if there's nothing in the official guidelines that explicitly prohibits EV chargers, they don't have a leg to stand on. It's an intimidation tactic." Lucas exhaled, feeling a small sense of relief. "So what do? We send a formal response, citing the lack of any clear violation. We also demand they provide specific documentation outlining exactly how your installation breaches the community standards. That'll put them in a position where they either have to admit they're making this up as they go or back off entirely. Lucas nodded. And if they still try to fine me? David chuckled. Then we escalate. If they push forward with penalties that have no legal basis, we counter with a suit for harassment and misrepresentation. Trust me. The last thing they want is for this to turn into a court case. They're banking on you folding under pressure. The moment they realize you're willing to fight, they'll think twice. Armed with this knowledge, Lucas felt more confident. He followed David's advice and sent the response letter the same day. It was professional, direct, and left no room for ambiguity. He didn't hear anything back immediately, which only confirmed his suspicion that they hadn't expected him to fight back. That night, he went to bed feeling like, for the first time since moving in, he had the upper hand. But Karen wasn't done. The next morning, Lucas woke up to find his front yard vandalized. Deep scratches had been carved into the hood of his Tesla, the once pristine paint now marred by jagged lines running across its surface. His mailbox had been knocked over, the metal post bent at an unnatural angle, and on the driveway, in large white chalk letters, someone had scrawled "Not welcome." A slow, burning rage settled in his chest. He immediately checked the security footage, scrolling through the night's recordings. At 2:47 a.m., the cameras caught movement. A dark figure, their face obscured by a hood, approached his driveway, carrying what looked like a metal tool. The person crouched near his car, then stood up moments later, the damage already done. They moved quickly, smashing the mailbox before grabbing a piece of chalk and writing the message on the pavement. Then, without hesitation, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. Lucas froze the frame, zooming in on the figure's build and posture. The footage was too dark to make out a face, but he could see enough to tell that this wasn't just some random act of vandalism. This was deliberate. This was personal. He called the police. When the officer arrived, he took one look at the damage inside, already seeming disinterested. Any idea who might have done this? Lucas clenched his jaw. I have my suspicions. The officer nodded slowly, flipping open a notepad. Do you have cameras? Yes, Lucas said, pulling up the footage on his phone. The officer watched, scratching his chin. It's clear someone did this intentionally, he admitted. But without a clear face, it's going to be tough to pin it on anyone. We can file a report, but unless you have direct evidence linking someone to this, there's not much we can do. Lucas exhaled sharply. He had expected this. The system wasn't built to deal with situations like this. It was designed for open and shut cases, not neighborhood power struggles. So that's it, he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. The officer shrugged. If you catch them in the act or get a clearer image, let us know. Otherwise, best I can do is file this as vandalism and advise you to stay vigilant. After the officer left, Lucas cleaned up the damage as best he could. He scheduled an appointment to have the scratches on his Tesla buffed out, replaced his mailbox, and washed away the chalk from his driveway. But the frustration didn't fade. If Karen thought this was going to scare him off, she was wrong. If anything, it made him more determined. That evening, he decided it was time to go on the offensive. He drafted a letter addressed directly to Karen, making it clear that he was aware of the ongoing harassment and that any further acts of vandalism, sabotage, or intimidation would result in immediate legal action. He wasn't going to play by her rules. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. He placed the letter in an envelope, walked across the street, and slipped it into Karen's mailbox. As he turned to leave, he saw her watching from behind her window, the curtain shifting slightly as she stepped back into the shadows. She knew, and now she knew that he knew. That night, Lucas didn't sleep easily. He lay awake, listening to the stillness outside, waiting for the next move. Because if there was one thing he had learned about people like Karen, it was that they never backed down quietly. Lucas knew that Karen wouldn't take his warning lightly. She was the kind of person who saw every challenge as a direct attack on her authority, and there was no way she would simply back down because of a strongly worded letter. The real question was how far she was willing to go, and he didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, he received another notice from the board, this time more aggressive than the first. It wasn't just a demand for the removal of his charging station, it was a formal declaration that he was now being fined daily for continued non-compliance. The amount was absurd, a blatant attempt to financially pressure him into submission. The attached document stated that failure to pay the fines could result in legal action and even a lien on his property. Lucas didn't even bother getting angry this time. He had expected this. Karen had lost the first round, so she was escalating in the only way she knew how, by weaponizing bureaucracy against him. But she had underestimated him. He forwarded the letter to his lawyer, who responded within an hour with an official dispute notice, demanding proof that the fines were legally justified. By law, they had to provide a legitimate reason for imposing financial penalties, and David was confident that they wouldn't be able to. Later that evening, Lucas was reviewing the footage from his security cameras when something strange caught his eye. Around 3 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of his property, standing still for several minutes before retreating back into the shadows. The person didn't approach the house or make any obvious moves, but there was something unsettling about the way they just stood there, watching. He replayed the footage several times, trying to get a clearer look, but the angle and lighting made it impossible to identify them. It was the next night when things escalated further. At exactly 2:42 a.m., an alert from his cameras woke him up. He grabbed his phone and pulled up the live feed just in time to see movement near his garage. His heart pounded as he focused on the figure. Someone crouched low, fiddling with something near his charging station. Without hesitation, he grabbed his flashlight and stormed outside, throwing the door open just as the intruder turned to flee. He didn't get a clear look at their face, but he saw enough. The person was wearing dark clothes, their features obscured by a hood. They bolted toward the street, disappearing into the night before Lucas could even think about chasing after them. He checked the charging station and found exactly what he had expected. Someone had tried to tamper with it again. This time they had loosened the connections, likely hoping to disable it or cause some kind of malfunction. Lucas called the police again, but just like before, there was little they could do. The officer who arrived took his statement, reviewed the footage, and repeated the same tired phrases without a clear ID. "We don't have much to go on, and keep your cameras rolling in case they come back." Lucas clenched his jaw, nodding as if he accepted the response, but deep down he knew he was on his own in this. If he wanted it to stop, he had to be the one to put an end to it. The next day he made a decision. He wasn't just going to sit back and react anymore. He was going to take the fight directly to Karen. He knew she was behind this, even if she wasn't the one sneaking onto his property at night. She was orchestrating it, pulling the strings, and he needed to make her understand that he wasn't someone she could intimidate. That afternoon he walked straight up to her house and rang the doorbell. He half expected her to pretend she wasn't home, but after a few moments, the door swung open, and there she was, standing with her usual poised expression, her eyes scanning him like he was something unpleasant she had stepped in. "Lucas," she said, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "What a surprise." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Cut the games, Karen," he said flatly. "I know what you're doing." Her smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, annoyance, maybe even a hint of amusement. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she replied smoothly. "But if this is about your fines, I suggest you take it up with the board. I have no control over those decisions." Lucas took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Someone was on my property last night, trying to sabotage my charger. And the night before that, someone stood outside my house watching. I don't think I need to spell out who's behind it." Karen tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence. "That sounds terrible. Have you spoken to the police?" "You know I have," he said, his patience thinning. "But we both know they won't do anything. Which is exactly why you think you can get away with this." She sighed, crossing her arms. "Lucas, I think you're letting your imagination get the best of you. I have no interest in whatever little games you think are being played. But if you're so concerned about safety, perhaps you should consider moving somewhere that better suits your lifestyle." There it was. The real message beneath all the pretense. She wasn't just trying to get rid of his charger, she was trying to get rid of him. Lucas stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. You want me gone that badly? Fine. But let me make something clear. I'm not going anywhere. And if I catch whoever's been messing with my property, they won't be dealing with the police. They'll be dealing with me. For the first time, Karen's expression hardened, the mask slipping just a little. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but Lucas didn't give her the chance. He turned and walked away, feeling her eyes burning into his back the entire time. When he got home, he didn't hesitate. He upgraded his security system, adding additional cameras and floodlights that would activate the moment someone stepped onto his property. He reinforced his charging station, making sure it was tamper-proof. And most importantly, he started preparing for the next step. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. The next morning, he received an email from his lawyer. The board had failed to provide any legal justification for the fines, which meant they were unenforceable. David was already drafting a formal complaint against them, one that would put them in an uncomfortable legal position if they continued their harassment. Lucas smiled to himself as he closed the email. Checkmate. Lucas had expected retaliation, but he had underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. The moment she realized her bureaucratic tactics weren't going to force him out, she escalated in ways that made it clear this was no longer about a simple dispute over a charging station. This was personal now. The board had gone silent ever since his lawyer's response made it clear that the fines they were trying to impose were unenforceable. They had no legal ground to stand on, and for the first time, Karen had lost control of the situation. But instead of backing off, she did what people like her always did when they felt their authority slipping. She found another way to exert power, another way to make it known that she wouldn't be ignored. It started with the whispers. The same neighbors who once exchanged polite greetings with Lucas now avoided eye contact when he walked by. Conversations quieted when he approached, and subtle but undeniable shifts in behavior made it clear that Karen had begun turning people against him. He wasn't surprised. She had spent years cementing herself as the unofficial ruler of this neighborhood, and she was using that influence now, painting him as the outsider, the troublemaker who had come in and disrupted their way of life. He could live with that. He didn't care what they thought of him. But what he couldn't ignore were the tangible consequences of her campaign against him. A few nights later, just past midnight, Lucas was jolted awake by a sudden, blaring noise. The piercing shriek of his car alarm echoed through the otherwise silent neighborhood, setting his pulse racing as he jumped out of bed and grabbed his phone. His security cameras had triggered an alert, and when he pulled up the live feed, he saw a figure sprinting away from his driveway, disappearing into the shadows. His Tesla's side mirror was shattered, glass littering the pavement. Whoever had done it had been fast, deliberate, and clearly knew how to avoid getting caught on camera. He rushed outside, scanning the street, but it was empty, eerily still. The only sign that anything had happened was the vandalism they had left behind, a deliberate message that this wasn't over. Lucas didn't bother calling the police this time. He already knew how that would go. An officer would show up, take a statement, maybe file a report, but nothing would come of it. Instead, he documented the damage himself, took photos, and forwarded them to his lawyer. David's response was swift. They're getting desperate. That's good. It means they know they're losing. But Lucas wasn't in the mood to celebrate a moral victory. He was tired of constantly watching his back, tired of being targeted for no other reason than he had refused to bend to Karen's will. And as he stood in his driveway that night, staring at the broken glass reflecting in the streetlights, something inside him settled. He wasn't going to let her win. The next day, he took his car in for repairs, had the mirror replaced, and installed reinforced glass on all windows. He upgraded his alarm system, making sure that next time, whoever tried to mess with his property wouldn't get away so easily. And then he made his move. He had learned something important over the past few weeks. Karen thrived on control, but what she feared most was exposure. She operated through intimidation, through backdoor deals and whispered conversations. She relied on people being too afraid to push back. So Lucas decided it was time to pull back the curtain. Through his lawyer, he filed a formal complaint not just against the board, but against Karen specifically. The complaint detailed the harassment, the false fines, the property damage, and the pattern of targeted intimidation. It included timestamps, security footage, and a full breakdown of how she had abused her position to turn the neighborhood against him. And then, just to make sure she felt the pressure, he leaked the story to a local journalist who covered community corruption. He didn't go public himself, he didn't need to. He simply provided the facts, let the evidence speak for itself, and watched as the pieces fell into place. The fallout was immediate. The board, desperate to distance itself from the controversy, announced that it would be reviewing its leadership structure, which was a polite way of saying that Karen's time in power was coming to an end. Neighbors who had once been loyal to her began to waver, suddenly unsure whether they wanted to be associated with the woman who was now the subject of legal scrutiny. But the best part was Karen's reaction. She didn't rage, didn't lash out the way Lucas had expected. Instead, she went quiet. Too quiet. And that's what made him uneasy. Then, one evening, just as the sun was setting, Lucas found something waiting for him at his front door. A single envelope, unmarked, placed carefully on the welcome mat. He picked it up, opened it, and felt his breath hitch as he read the words inside. You should have left when you had the chance. There was no signature, no indication of who had written it. But he didn't need one. He knew exactly who had sent it. Karen wasn't done. Not yet. Lucas had expected retaliation after filing the formal complaint, but he hadn't expected Karen to remain so eerily silent. The board was already distancing itself from her, and the neighbors who had once blindly followed her lead were beginning to reconsider their loyalties. It should have been the beginning of the end, the moment where her influence finally crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. She had spent too many years maintaining her authority, and if there was one thing Lucas had learned, it was that people like her never went down without a fight. The message left on his doorstep confirmed what he had already suspected. Karen still had one more move to make. It wasn't over, not yet. Lucas stood in his entryway, gripping the letter tightly, the words he should have left when you had the chance burning into his mind. It was a threat, not an empty one, but a promise that she wasn't finished with him. He wasn't sure what she had planned, but he knew he had to be ready. That night, Lucas barely slept. He kept his phone close, checking the security feeds every time he heard the faintest sound outside. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual late-night traffic on the distant main road seemed non-existent. His body was tense with anticipation, knowing something was coming but not knowing when. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., his phone vibrated. Motion detected. His heart pounded as he opened the security app, pulling up the live footage. At first, he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The driveway was empty, the street still, but then he noticed something. His motion-activated floodlights had been turned off. Not just one, but all of them. Someone had tampered with the system. A spike of adrenaline shot through him as he scrolled back through the footage, rewinding to a few minutes earlier. There, barely visible in the darkness, was a shadowed figure moving along the side of his house, just out of range of the cameras. They had known exactly where the blind spots were. Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and gave the dispatcher a brief, urgent summary of the situation. As he spoke, he moved to the front window, carefully pulling back the curtain to scan the street. He couldn't see anyone now, but that didn't mean they weren't still out there. The thought sent a chill down his spine. The police arrived within 10 minutes, 2 squad cars pulling up with their headlights cutting through the darkness. Officers swept the perimeter, checking for any signs of forced entry or damage. One of them, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, approached Lucas as he stood on the porch. "You're sure someone was out here?" the officer asked, flipping through a small notepad. Lucas pulled up the footage on his phone and handed it over. "They disabled my floodlights. They knew exactly where to move without being seen." The officer watched the video carefully, nodding slowly. "Looks like whoever it was knew what they were doing." "You said you've had problems with a particular neighbor." Lucas exhaled sharply. "Yeah, Karen Harper. She's been trying to force me out since the day I moved in. Vandalism, harassment, false fines, you name it. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before jotting something down. "We'll have a chat with her. But unless we catch her in the act or she slips up, there's not much we can do beyond filing a report." Lucas clenched his jaw. He had expected that answer, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. The police couldn't, or wouldn't, do anything until she made a direct mistake. And Karen was too smart for that. She never got her own hands dirty, always using others to do her bidding. But this was different. This wasn't just bureaucratic harassment or turning the neighbors against him. This was something more dangerous. The next morning, Lucas decided it was time to end this once and for all. He didn't care about playing by Karen's rules anymore. He was done waiting for her next move. He drove straight to the office of his lawyer, David Crane, and told him everything that had happened. The threats, the vandalism, the late-night prowler, every single escalation since this had begun. David listened carefully, his expression darkening with every detail. "This isn't just about property disputes anymore," David finally said. "This is criminal harassment, possibly even stalking. If she's bold enough to send people onto your property in the middle of the night, she's bold enough to take it further. We need to act now." Lucas nodded. "So what do we do?" David leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk as he considered their options. "We file a restraining order, a formal one. If we can prove a pattern of harassment, the court won't hesitate to grant it. That will legally prohibit her from contacting you, coming near your property, or engaging in any further actions against you. If she does, she'll be in violation of the order. And then the police will have no choice but to act." It was exactly the kind of legal leverage Lucas needed. That afternoon, they gathered all the evidence, security footage, documented incidents, official complaints, and even the board's previous attempts to fine him under Karen's influence. By the time they were done, they had compiled an airtight case. Within days, the order was approved, and Karen was formally served with the documents. Lucas didn't hear from her directly, but he saw the effects immediately. The neighbors who had once been wary of speaking to him now offered quiet nods of acknowledgement. The tension that had suffocated the neighborhood since his arrival began to lift, if only slightly. Even the board, eager to wash their hands of the entire ordeal, issued a new set of guidelines clarifying that property owners had the right to install EV charging stations without interference. It wasn't just a win, it was a complete and total defeat for Karen. But the real moment of closure came a few days later. Lucas was outside, enjoying the first peaceful evening he'd had in months, when he saw Karen for what he knew would be the last time. She was standing in her driveway, watching as a moving truck was being loaded with boxes. She had lost. The restraining order, the public exposure, the loss of her influence, she couldn't recover from it. The house that had been her kingdom for years was no longer hers, and she knew it. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Karen's face was unreadable, her usual smug confidence replaced with something else. Bitterness, maybe even resentment, but there was no more fight left in her. Without a word, she turned and walked inside. Lucas didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like he had won some great battle. He just felt relieved. It was over. Finally, truly over. That night, for the first time since moving in, he plugged in his Tesla, stepped inside, and fell into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. The morning after Karen's moving truck disappeared down the street, Lucas stepped outside to find the neighborhood eerily calm. For the first time since he had moved in, there were no passive-aggressive notes in his mailbox, no glares from Karen's loyal followers, no vandalism waiting to be cleaned up. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, as if he had spent so long preparing for the next attack that his body didn't quite know how to handle the absence of conflict. He had won. The legal battles were over, the restraining order was in place, and Karen was gone, forced to abandon the home she had ruled over like a personal kingdom. But the strangest part wasn't her absence, it was the way the neighborhood itself seemed to shift the moment she left. As Lucas walked down the driveway toward his Tesla, he noticed a few neighbors cautiously stepping outside, people who had spent the last several months avoiding him or pretending he didn't exist. There was a hesitancy in their movements, as if they weren't sure whether they were allowed to acknowledge him now that Karen wasn't there to dictate how they should feel. Then, one of them, an older man who lived 2 houses down, gave him a small nod. It was the first time he had received any kind of friendly gesture from him. A woman who had previously glared at his car every time she passed by now looked at him with something closer to neutrality than hostility. Later that afternoon, as Lucas was installing a new security update to his home system, his doorbell rang. He checked the camera feed before opening the door, old habits dying hard, and saw his next-door neighbor, a man named Greg, standing there looking uncertain. Lucas hadn't spoken more than a few words to him since moving in. He opened the door, waiting for whatever awkward conversation was about to happen. "Hey," Greg said, clearing his throat, "just wanted to say, well, I know things have been kind of tense around here." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Tense is one way to put it." Greg gave a dry chuckle, nodding. "Look, I'll be honest. A lot of us didn't know what to think when you moved in. Karen had been running things here for so long. And she had a way of making people fall in line. Some of us went along with it because it was easier. I guess what I'm trying to say is, not everyone agreed with what she did, and now that she's gone, maybe things can start fresh." Lucas studied him for a moment, trying to gauge whether this was genuine or just damage control. He could see the slight discomfort in Greg's posture, the way he kept shifting his weight as if he wasn't used to admitting something like this. But there was something else to relief. Not just at Karen being gone, but at the fact that he could finally say it out loud. Lucas nodded. "Fresh sounds good." Greg exhaled, looking like he hadn't been sure what response he was expecting. "Good. And if you ever need anything, well, I guess now that Karen's not breathing down everyone's necks, maybe we can all act like neighbors again." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a start. And Lucas figured that was enough for now. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood continued to shift. The board, now under new leadership, quietly retracted many of the unnecessary restrictions Karen had put in place over the years. A few people who had once been her strongest supporters either moved away or kept to themselves, while others, like Greg, slowly began trying to rebuild bridges they had previously burned. The atmosphere changed, not overnight, but little by little, until the tension that had once been suffocating seemed to dissolve into something resembling normalcy. Lucas no longer had to check his cameras every 5 minutes. He no longer found himself waiting for the next battle to unfold. The damage Karen had done to the community wouldn't disappear immediately, but at least now it had a chance to heal. One evening, as he sat outside on his porch, watching the last bit of sunlight fade behind the rooftops, he let himself finally relax in a way he hadn't since moving in. He had never planned on becoming the guy who took down the neighborhood tyrant. He had just wanted to live his life without interference. But now, sitting there with nothing but the quiet hum of the evening around him, he realized something he had done more than just stand his ground. He had changed something. Maybe not in some grand, dramatic way, but in a way that mattered. He took a deep breath, stood up, and headed inside. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about what might happen next. Because finally, it was over. A month had passed since Karen's departure, and the neighborhood had settled into an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace. The lingering tension that had once felt like an ever-present weight was now gone, replaced by something Lucas hadn't expected: genuine quiet. It wasn't the eerie, watchful silence that had followed him during those first few months, when he knew Karen and her loyal followers were waiting for him to slip up. This was different. The absence of conflict, of constant vigilance, of waiting for the next attack, it was a relief so profound that he hadn't even realized how much stress he had been carrying until it was finally lifted. One evening, as he sat on his back patio, the soft hum of his Tesla charging in the garage, he let himself reflect on everything that had happened. It felt surreal looking back at how quickly things had escalated, how a simple charging station had turned into a full-blown war over control, power, and dominance. Karen had been willing to do whatever it took to force him out, but in the end she had been the one to lose everything. Lucas had never set out to fight her, but when it became clear that there was no other choice, he had refused to back down. And because of that, he was still here, still standing, still living his life the way he had intended from the start. It wasn't just about winning. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about the fact that no one should have to justify their right to exist peacefully in their own home. That was what Karen had never understood. Her authority had never been real. It had been based on fear, on intimidation, on people's unwillingness to challenge her. The moment someone did, the moment she was forced to face someone who wouldn't break under pressure, everything she had built came crashing down. Lucas took a slow sip of his drink, feeling the cool night air settle around him. He thought about the neighbors who had once avoided him, now making small but noticeable efforts to undo the damage they had helped create. He thought about the new leadership on the board, about the quiet removal of the unnecessary restrictions that had made life in the neighborhood feel suffocating. And he thought about himself, about how much he had changed through all of this. He had never been someone who sought out confrontation, but he had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. As he leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky, he finally allowed himself to feel it. Not just relief, not just satisfaction, but something deeper, something stronger, a sense of closure. It was over. And this time it was for good.